Hello, welcome to Fresh Take from What Fresh Hell, laughing in the face of motherhood. This is Margaret, and today I am talking to Erica Ladd and Kelsey Wharton, who are two good friends and former next-door neighbors who co-host the Girl Next Door podcast, a show that feels like hanging out with your girlfriends. They bring their different perspectives, sounds familiar to every topic, and haven't run out of things to talk and laugh about yet. Welcome, Erica and Kelsey.
Hello, we're so happy to be here.
Today, we're talking about boundaries, something we've talked about before on the podcast, but and we'll get there, certainly boundaries around the holidays. But let's back up a little bit and talk about boundaries. I feel like boundaries, grit, I don't know, there's certain terms that in the parenting and living spaces, people throw around a lot, right? Like I've stated my boundaries, she has her boundaries, she's enforcing her boundaries. And it's kind of one of those things of like, what is this? What do boundaries mean to you when you hear the term boundaries?
I'm going to say Erica should go first on this. Erica's superpower is boundaries. So
we
take
can
it
learn.
away. I have learned so much from her.
We are here to study at the throne of Erica.
That's so funny. Boundaries. I love a good boundary, probably to a fault. Okay, so I've heard some great definitions about boundaries, but one of my favorites and my personal one that I've adopted is a boundary is where you end and I begin. So I love that because so often we think a boundary is about walling ourselves off or enforcing these strict rules with our people, right? And really, I think it's just simply like clearly marking off your space, be that physical, mental, emotional. It's the whole fences make good neighbors thing, right? So even metaphorical fences. So that is kind of how I look at boundaries.
I think that's really true. And I think we talk a lot on the podcast, whether it's gift giving or setting rules of, can you have this conversation once? Yeah. And I think one of the gifts of boundaries, I have some issues with boundaries, but one of the gifts of boundaries is that you can have a conversation once. Remember, when we yell, we lose, whatever. Not quite a boundary, I guess it's more of a rule, but like we've decided to split the holidays between our two different extended families and alternate years. And so that the discussion doesn't have to happen every single year where we're starting from scratch at take the knife out of the ham and just stab me if you're not going to come for Christmas, which by the way is a Sopranos reference for those of you who are younger than me.
It's like, what kind of holidays are you having?
Yeah.
No, that's the Soprano. The mom on the Sopranos is like, at some point, she's like, take the knife out of the ham.
I love that. And I think that's a lot of my motivation for creating boundaries. I get such decision fatigue and also just immediate fatigue over whining and negotiating from kids about things. I do want to decide about it one time. I want to make it very clear. And I do think that that goes for larger family dynamics too. I sort of don't want to revisit every single year. How do we do this? And those same pain points come up over and again. I would rather kind of do some of that harder work. If it is harder, think about it, talk about it. Let's come to an agreement, hopefully for smoother sailing in the future.
I think that's right. And you said, right, Erica, you're good at boundaries. I think for a lot of people, you know, a lot of us, especially females, if I may be gendered for a moment, grew up to be pleasers, right? That like it's our role to make people feel good and make people happy. And that as a young person, sometimes that's easier. And then as we get older and we marry and we have kids and we have jobs and we have all these different responsibilities, that if we keep trying to please everybody, we either, one, get in trouble with people because we're promising things we can't deliver, or we are constantly triggering that scared part of ourselves that's like, oh, I'm doing that thing I hate the most, which is letting people down.
And not only probably leaving very little, if anything, for yourself, and maybe losing touch with even how to get in touch with what you need and what boundaries you need when you're thinking so much about giving to others.
That's right. If there's ever a time that you need to set better boundaries, it's when you are spread thin, that you have to. I think for a lot of people, the idea of saying no is so challenging that if you don't decide it in advance, it's almost like you can't do it.
You can't do it on the spot.
That's right. That like you can't be put to the test to say no. You have to have no as a policy. And then it's like, see reference A.
Right.
Remember, we talked about this.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And I think about this too. It might even be a reference from an older episode of the Mom Hour, which of course we love and gotten so much wisdom from them. Mm-hmm. But I think they said something about basically saying no, or I think setting a boundary being a muscle that you exercise. It is a practice. Yes. Start in little ways, saying no to volunteering to that class party if it's something you don't really want to do and don't have the time to do, and work up to saying no to your mother-in-law that you can't come for Christmas this year. Do you know what I mean? So you do have to think about those little ones. And I do think the more you practice and you get used to saying that and saying it without apology, you can work up to the bigger ones, but it is a practice. It's hard.
Well, and I think the hard part about boundaries in general, especially that gendered side of it, like you were talking about, is they have this automatic negative connotation. We don't want to be harsh. We don't want to disappoint anyone, like you said, but we have to be willing to sometimes disappoint someone else sometimes, and not just always ourselves and our own immediate family. And that's what ends up happening. Like you said, when you don't set them, you get in trouble with other people, but it also causes all this internal conflict, all this conflict with maybe your spouse or your kids, because you're not actually getting, the holiday you want or the schedule you want, because you're just so afraid of disappointing everyone out there. And I think it's not okay to just constantly disappoint ourselves because we're too afraid to set a boundary, That's
right. That we forget in the story of like, I don't want to hurt anyone, that has to include yourself and your family and your kids.
Exactly.
Because often we feel like, well, I don't want to hurt anyone, so I'm going to do something that is going to make myself and perhaps my nuclear family unhappy.
Right.
Challenging. And I also think there's phraseology around this. Kelsey, you were talking about this idea of practicing it, and I hadn't thought that much about it, but that it's like a toolbox that goes with your boundaries. So what that phrase looks like, because also there are people who are quite good at manipulating, people who are pleasers, right? And so you need to really practice the thing of, I know if somebody expresses disappointment in me, that can trigger me to be like, okay, all bets are off. We have to fix this. Like the idea that I could sleep if someone was disappointed in me is absurd. Like that's clearly not going to happen. And really practicing phrases for the other person, but also for yourself, which is, I have chosen to prioritize my family's needs, and talking through that. And like, do you have any kind of phrases or things you go to when people, because I don't tend to be like, this is a boundary that we have set. I don't tend to put it in those terms. I do think that can be kind of triggering for people of like,
it's kind of annoying, like, and like
they learn that in therapy and now they're
it sounds very serious.
Sounds condescending kind of, or like, oh, look at you with your therapy phrases.
Exactly.
So how do you express your boundaries? Do you have go-tos?
Well, I think first of all, less is more. I think that's part of the problem, is we end up thinking that we need to explain everything to the nth degree. And when in doubt, just say less and be very clear and focus more on what you will be doing. So instead of like, we won't be coming to Thanksgiving this year because of this, and this, instead just say, we're going to be spending Thanksgiving with John's family or whatever. We would love to have you for dessert or brunch later that weekend. Which one of those work for you?
That's
offer
so smart.
Offer up.
Do you see why it's her superpower?
Boundary queen. I'm really getting it. I'm seeing it.
You have to almost think about it like
throw around that phrase superpower, but I'm really seeing it.
Lots of practice. But honestly, it's almost like talking to a toddler. You don't, especially someone who's disappointed, you don't give them a ton of like open options. You give them one or two things that you're showing, hey, I value spending time with you. It's important. And you're giving them some agency again, because I think that's part of why people push back. That's why you get the mother-in-law pushback sometimes, or whatever it might be, because they feel out of control. They feel like they're no longer in control of the family and what the family does. And I'm just at everybody else's mercy, the long suffering. So I think giving them a couple options that, like, hey, and it shuts down that, like, oh, you don't want to see me, just stab me with the fork. It shuts that down because you just already offered up what you are willing to do.
I think that's right. And I think it's good to remember that, like, we are going to be mothers-in-law someday. And like our own traditions and our own expectations of what our family looks like is going to be a hard change for us as well. And like practicing this is just such a good idea. And I think that advice is really solid. It's like where we get lost is getting drawn into conversations that become fights, that become bad feelings, where if you put up a wall, but you kind of keep it very simple, there's less to fight about. I have another thought about that. We're going to take a break and we're going to continue talking about boundaries right after this. So my mother was a therapist, and she had a phrase that she used all the time, which I didn't understand back as a young person. But now that I have kids, I'm like, total revelation, which is boundary seeking behavior. And she uses it in relation to kids a lot, that like kids that sometimes I think as parents trying to be pleasing, trying to have a happy home, we move our walls back and back and back because people are pushing against them. But that in fact, if we can reframe some of this behavior as boundary seeking behavior, this could be coming from our kids. So a kid who's starting to try out curse words, and, people have different boundaries around that, which is fine. Some people allow cursing in their house. Some people don't. Some people allow the adults to curse, but not the kids. Some people allow it during songs, not during it. All sorts of different versions of that. But I know when my kids start using curse words, like it's like, they're seeking, what they're asking me is, where is the line on this?
Exactly.
And it is my job to provide that line and to hold that line, which is challenging and hard. Yeah. So another version of boundaries is how we set them for our kids. What kind of experiences have you had around that?
I will say, I feel like one thing I am trying to do, kind of like you're describing, is to observe a little bit. And, like on curse words, for example, it might be something that I kind of put a soft boundary in place at first and kind of observe. Is this a thing they're just wanting to do kind of once? Is it really a pattern that they're picking up? I can think of other behaviors around this, but just kind of observing before. I think sometimes I tend to want to come in with like a hard and fast boundary. And some of that I feel like is beneficial to bring your kids into that if they're old enough. Like I'm having tweens now, to kind of see where that middle ground is. Maybe not necessarily on cursing, but anyway, that's one example I'll give.
Yeah. I think too, just remembering overall that is your job, like you said, as the parent, and if we are keeping that negative connotation in our head about boundaries, that's going to transfer into dealing with our kids. And really, boundaries don't have to be harsh. They don't have to be punitive. They do not have to be about what you can't do. They can be about what you can do. Like, you may be on your phone whenever your schoolwork is done for the day. You may, it doesn't have to just be no, don't. And I think if we can flip our own thinking about that,
really smart,
that helps.
Yeah. That we don't have to just see ourselves as like the no machine, that we're helping our kids, because finishing work before being on our phone, like I would like someone to set that boundary for me, because I struggle with that myself. But like that's a healthy approach to something. And it's kind of nice to be that observer and help with that. And I think that's an interesting point, that boundaries, we tend to think of them as like we're the mean ogre, like standing at the wall being like, don't come in here. But it can be a little bit more. And I think one of the things that in doing the podcast for so many years, I've really changed my mind on is that rules make kids feel really safe. Another thing my mom used to say is keep the lines tighter than you actually want them to be, because kids want to feel the feeling of going outside the lines. But, like cursing is such a simple example, but my kids are now tweens and teens. They have used curse words. I'm pretty aware of it. We're pretty strict about it in the house, but they love sneaking and cursing. And then when I catch them, I'm like, oh, I'm so sorry.
Right.
And I think it is, Kelsey, you said it, it's a fluid kind of situation, but I think that kids are looking for that container. They don't actually want to feel like everything is out of bounds.
Right. I mean, you can see it think about a classroom setting, or back when you were in the classroom. I was an elementary teacher for a long time, and you can see even other kids be anxious about where is the teacher going to draw the line when a kid is crossing it, right? It makes everybody feel on edge when they're not sure that the adult is in charge, because that's how nature works, right? Like, we're the ones with the developed brain, ideally.
That's right.
And so, like, if we are just constantly treating our kids as an equal in terms of decision making, like, yes, they are a whole person and should be respected as such, but they don't make good decisions yet. Like, their brain is not developed. So our job is to help them do that. And the way we do that is through boundaries. And it's just a part of the deal. It's like feeding them. It's like, taking them places. It's just a part of the deal. It's not us being mean.
Right. It's doing the job. And I think that element of safety and that, that feeling, everyone's had that feeling where some member of the house is out of control, and it sets a level of tension among everyone in the house, because it feels like we're outside of the parameters of what we understand to be the rules. And that is a scary feeling, not just for our kids, but for us as well. It can be really scary. And so let's talk a little bit about, I think sometimes we've heard feedback from people of things are out of control in my house. And it feels like the boundaries were walls and the kids ran through them. And now we're all just off
there's
the map.
Bricks everywhere.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, it's like, wait a minute. And I think for people, boundaries feel sometimes a little too one and done. Like, if people go through them, then, we're hosed. So how do we reset boundaries if we feel like things have gotten to that out of control place?
Well, I think it's, first of all, really important to remember that a boundary is not about controlling other people's behavior, including your kids.
Say more about that.
A boundary is what you are going to tolerate or accept, or what you want around you, and how you're going to react if that boundary is crossed. So, for example, if the boundary is, and this is really hard for me because I would rather that boundaries were about controlling everybody else's behavior.
Oh, I mean, the whole world would be so much easier if we could just control other people.
Yes, I really want it to be that way, but it's not. So even so people think like, okay, I set this rule or this boundary for my kids. They broke it. Now what? Well, the now what is the boundary actually. The boundary is, let's say the rule is you don't curse in the house.
Right.
We don't curse in this house, right? So they push against that rule, which they're going to. So the boundary then is what is clearly communicating what the consequence is going to be and calmly and firmly following through on it. It's not, and that could be whatever you decide, whatever you and your partner, that can look like all kinds of different things, and you may need to try a couple different things, but it's about consistently and firmly following through on that. It's not controlling the fact that they will never swear again. Like, that's not how it goes. And so I think what happens,
that's probably not even
too,
desired. Right.
Right. And I think what happens is when kids break a rule, you assume your rule wasn't working.
Right.
No, they're supposed to break the rules. That's what like you said, that is what they do. And it may take a few times before that behavior actually is ingrained, where they're like, oh yeah, mom's not kidding. I can't swear in the house. You don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater because they broke the rule, or the toddler throws the tantrum when you set a firm limit. So that means that limit is wrong. No.
Right. Or some kids see a wall and they're like, oh, hooray, a wall. I love being on this cozy, safe side of it. And then some kids see a wall and they're like, what the heck's on the other side of that?
Yeah,
I got to go see.
They grab a chisel.
That's right. And that's so right, that kids are going to respond really, really differently to those situations. I also think this is something we can discuss with kids, right? And we can say, like, I have noticed lately that the cursing in our house has gotten completely out of control. And we're going to do an all family reset on this. And we can say, like, I know for me, this reset usually happens around meals and food. And like, okay, we're going to stop. We're like, I forget to cook dinner, so everyone grabs a cheese stick and sits in a different room in the house on their phone. Like, that's actually not what I want my life to look like. And so I think involving the kids in it can, and you probably don't use the word boundary in that, but like, it feels like we're all on our phones too much. It feels, I don't like the fact that there's so much fighting between the siblings. Like, we can go back, right? And try to reset that for them. How do we do that?
What do you think, Kels?
Yeah, I would say I really like what you're bringing up of having that family conversation. And honestly, that's one of the things that I'm enjoying so much about having tweens. And I currently have a tween, one who's on his way to being a tween, and a toddler. So I'm kind of getting like the tantrum, the tween and the toddler tantrums. It's very interesting and sometimes very challenging. But what I really enjoy about those tweens is being able to have those conversations with them and hear their feedback and hear their ideas and bringing them into creating that family dynamic and still very much asserting myself and my husband as like, you know, we are the ultimate authority figures, but we are here to hear your feedback. And kind of like Erica was mentioning the consequences, I think, you know, anything that you establish, we try as much as possible to have natural consequences as much as possible. You know, I hear some friends going to consequences like being grounded and just having to come home from school and be in their room or, you know, whatever it is.
No screens tends to be a big one, right?
Yeah. And as much as possible, I try to think about what if there's a natural consequence to that. I mean, maybe them being late to school and not having done their homework, that is a consequence, you know, if they didn't get up in time, get their stuff done in time, whatever it is. And so trying to pair a natural consequence like that, and like you said, talking about it, making it very clear, and then firmly, but consistently enforcing it.
Yeah, we're dealing with that right now with my teen. And it's, you know, the getting up in the morning has just become like a no holds barred, you know, wrestle-o-rama match, not physically, but verbal wrestling.
Right.
And we did finally just have a kind of moment of, oh, what if we completely stop doing this and say, we have to drive in our town, there's no buses. This is when the car's leaving and you're not in it. You can walk
and
or
see
ride
that's
your
your
bike.
boundary then. This is when the car is leaving. You're not saying like this is when you must be up.
Right. You're
saying this is when the car is leaving.
Differently. That's right. It's an interesting change of idea of this is the decision I'm making for my own sanity. And it just cuts down on so much craziness.
And it helps you with you feel like you have a plan.
Yes.
It feels like, okay, this, because I have a kiddo who will push. I have one that loves the wall and wants to stay on the safe side of the wall at all times. And I have another who will, anytime she's going through a new developmental phase, anytime we're trying something new, it's push and push and push until you show me that you can handle this in a calm, consistent way. Right. And I, of course, forget that every time. And I'm like, what is this new phase we're having where we're refusing to do our work or you know what I mean? Like whatever it is. And I'm like, oh yeah, she's going to keep doing that until I just show her that I mean what I say with my boundary and not try to like force her into this box of compliance. You know, she just wants to see, yep, mom's in charge. She's not bothered. But until I can show her that, it doesn't happen.
You got a problem. You know? And as we were saying, then you're only having the fight once, right? It's like, remember, see Exhibit A. Like we have this hopefully, before. Hopefully. Believe me, you're never going to have the fight once, people. It's
right. You know what? I want to follow up on that too, thinking about the kids getting ready in the morning or maybe getting their work done on time. I think that sometimes when we set one of those boundaries, we also have to remember there is a certain element of us letting go. Yes. I think it can be so powerful for you saying the car is leaving at this time, but then letting that kid get ready how they want, when they want, if they're rolling in without deodorant. I mean, that's a natural consequence.
Pants, let's say, that are 4 inches too short for them.
Right.
Yes.
So I think maybe sometimes we have to remember some of that too. Like we set a boundary, and for kids of a certain age, it is really important for them to meet that boundary, but however they get there. And we kind of have to practice too, here's the boundary. You meet it how you want. And then you can go from there. If you are noticing like, okay, now that you're getting here on time, let's talk about
add deodorant
maybe
to the mix.
combing your hair, whatever it is.
Exactly. Totally agree. When we come back, we're going to be talking about holiday boundaries. Oh, holiday boundaries. So much to say. So I found this Brene Brown quote, which people have probably heard before, but she talks about how boundaries are about choosing discomfort over resentment. And I think at the holidays, like this rings in my head. The idea, she always talks, she has a ring. And whenever anyone asks her to do something, she has to turn the ring a certain amount of times before she answers. And I think at the holidays, I mean, people think about sharing time with families. We've talked about a little bit, but just the mom plate, just everybody walks by and adds something to it.
Yeah.
And so how do we begin to think about setting boundaries around the holidays?
Oh boy. We actually just recorded a podcast episode yesterday that's all about holiday logistics.
Yes.
And kind of calendar management. I think that's the first place to start your holiday boundaries is early and just trying to wrap your head around logistics. And if you are, if you're married, you're parenting with someone, they need to be part of that decision too. So I think there's just a kind of like getting the big picture of it and kind of going from there. So I would say that is a great first place to start.
Yeah, I think too, just remembering that part of the reason holiday boundaries are even harder is there's so many feelings wrapped up in the holidays. There's so many traditions. It feels like your relationship and how much you value it is wrapped up in said traditions sometimes. And there's inevitably, though, a lot of change. Like you said, one day we're going to be the mothers-in-law, perhaps. And we have to remember that, like, we're all supposed to change. If no, some of these traditions were started because somebody changed. Someone had a baby and wanted to do it a different way. Someone moved to another state. And then you get these great traditions that you might not have otherwise, too. So I think remembering that, for instance, my family is very traditional at Christmas, and we're from Wisconsin. I was the bad one that moved away to Arizona. And I'm the oldest. And so I was the first one to kind of rock the holiday boat. And I went back to Wisconsin for a few years and then realized this is dumb. We are whisper fighting in my childhood bedroom. We're on no sleep. We paid, $2,000 to come here. The weather is horrible. Our flight is canceled. And I saw everybody for a total of like 2 hours because we all had, siblings had in-laws to go to, all of that. And it was like, I needed to be uncomfortable for a couple years and make my parents especially a little uncomfortable for a couple years, but now they love it and come to us and we have the best time. And they, I did that before we even had kids because we were just so miserable doing it. And I'm like, this is making me not enjoy my family. Why would I keep doing this? But now we have new traditions because of that. So I think reminding yourself that like, yes, it might be uncomfortable, but you might start something new that ends up being your favorite family thing that you do because you were willing to, shake things up a little bit. So,
I mean, my sister-in-law and my brother got married when they were quite young. I mean, right out of college. And my sister-in-law came to our first Christmas and we had all slept together in the same room before Christmas. I mean, Christmas Eve, all the siblings slept in one room. And we were 22. And my sister-in-law was like, this is weird. And it's a no for me. Like, I'm not sleeping with my boyfriend and his 3 weird sisters. And we were genuinely appalled. Like, what? Yes. This is what we do on Christmas Eve.
I guess you hate Christmas.
And she was like, what are you, 10? Like, get over yourselves. And I mean, she was nice about it, but she was definitely sort of like, okay, weirdos, no. And she wasn't like, I'm stating my boundaries.
Right. Yes.
Right. I do think
kind of held up a mirror.
That's it. I mean, would we have done it till we were 35? Possibly.
Right.
It would have been totally unsightly.
At some time, these things have to change, right?
I mean, things do have to change, but change is really, really hard for people. We talked to Suzanne Katz-Miller. She does the Interfaith Family Journal, and it's a workbook for people bringing in different family traditions, specifically religious traditions.
Mm-hmm.
But even if you're both East Coast Irish Catholics who celebrate Christmas on Christmas morning, like you do everything the same way, there's still the weird like sibling sleepover, or maybe you don't want to get in the matching pajamas. Like there's still going to be boundaries to explore.
Or like you said, what happens when mom and dad are not mom and dad of their immediate cozy little family anymore, but they're grandma and grandpa.
Right.
And now you know what I mean? Like that, those roles shift. So the traditions kind of have to shift with that.
That's right. And she uses this term that I thought was really useful, which is the sacred circle. And like your sacred circle changes throughout your life. So like as your original, let's say family of origin was mom, dad, and kids. That was your sacred circle. But then when you get married, you move into that person's sacred circle. And it's hard. And it's a hard transition. But I think if you try to live in both sacred circles, it doesn't work at all.
Right.
And so figuring out new traditions, is that something like when you made your change, Erica, was that something that you sat down and had a conversation with everyone about? I assume the conversation started with your spouse and then you took it.
Like I said, literally whisper fight, the fight you do in front of family.
Yes, we
so
do.
We're, in my childhood bedroom with posters up on the wall and whatever, and just like going at each other's throat. Right. And in tears, and really we had a flight home where we just talked about it the whole time. Like, why are we doing this? Like, what is the point of this? We are missing out on any quality time at Christmas. We're getting back, Christmas is done and over with, and we have had no personal time. What would this look like when we have kids? And then, had some really honest, tearful conversations with my parents because they were, again, I was the first. I got married pretty young, so I still had a couple siblings at home even at the time. And so it was really hard on top of the fact that we live in another state. Now we're not coming home for Christmas, But again, I think part of it too is things change. And so then when we had kids, when they were little, we stayed home. But now we're like, hey, come join us. It's not as much upheaval for you know what I mean? Like everything changes. Just because you do something one year doesn't mean that's how you always have to do it. It's okay to say what works for you in this season and then go from there.
And Kelsey, let's talk a little bit about the, and you wouldn't mind being on the committee, and hey, could you get the Secret Santa gifts for everyone? And hey, we're having the Hanukkah event, and would you mind bringing stuff? Like, how do we set boundaries and not, because I do think this is where the resentment piece comes in, right? That you end up, I got a robe on Christmas morning, and it's just like, I hate everyone, and the holiday was you were just the elf or whatever your tradition was that created all the magic, and then you end the day in a pile of like wrapping paper and dishes and hating the world. How do we avoid that, Kelsey?
I'm just laughing because it's just so relatable.
Yeah, we've all been there.
Okay, so I guess I do kind of think about going back to like looking at October, November, December, or at least November, December, and just kind of taking stock of what your bandwidth is going to be and just kind of recognizing, okay, I'm kind of already heading into the holidays with a little bit lower bandwidth. I still have a toddler, so just my time at home, just mornings and evenings can be very depleting, and just recognizing that and giving myself credit for that. And I think then just at the start of it, giving myself permission, like I am going to be willing to say no to things, or if something comes to me and I don't immediately feel like, yes, I can definitely do that, or I want to do that, I have permission to say no. And some advice that my mom gave me a long time ago, because I can be a people pleaser. I am like a worrier if I have done anything wrong, disappointed anyone. And she told me, don't feel guilty if you haven't done anything wrong. And I think about that often. Is it wrong to say, no, I can't bring those extra cupcakes for the holiday party? No, that is fine. Like that's nothing that you need to feel guilty about.
It's a yes or no question, and you answered it no, and that's fine.
Exactly. Yeah, no was an option, and I answered
and I chose no. That's the one I chose. And I know you've talked about it on your podcast, and this really stuck out to me, that boundaries are not about handling crazy people, which is sometimes what we think, or as we say, crazy makers, right? Like people who are just chaos agents. It's about how you want your life to look. So let's finish there. Like what does that mean? What is that distinction? Because I think I get it, but I want to make sure.
Well, I think it kind of goes along with what Kelsey was saying, where to me, if it's not a heck yes, it's a no. You know, because what you're going to end up with otherwise is looking around at all of your things that were like meh, or I didn't really want to do that. And then your life is full of meh, and I didn't want to do that. And that's where the resentment comes from. That's where this, like, I don't even recognize myself or my life. I didn't want to be this person. So you have to pay attention and first of all, spend some time thinking, how do I want the holidays to feel? How do I want my life to feel? How do I want our weeknights as a family to feel? Are we good with going to sports every night, or do we need more downtime than that? And scheduling and then fiercely protecting that downtime. And by fiercely protecting, I don't mean from the big bad outside world, but like from yourself, who just wants to say yes to everybody, and saying, no, I have decided, or we've decided as a family, that we need 2 weeknights with no activities to not feel crazy, and stick to that, and not fill up that calendar just because it technically is a blank space. Do you know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. And it gives you an easy no, which is like, oh, I can't do that. It's Tuesday. I'm otherwise committed.
And you can just say,
I'm
we're
committed
busy
to my bed. You don't need to know that, but I'm otherwise committed.
Right. It's the less is more.
It's the less is more. You don't exactly need to know all of my reasons why. I really love this conversation. I think everyone should take as homework to take a pause tonight and have a conversation. What is our holiday? What do we want our holidays to look like? And what is getting in the way of that? And what boundaries can we set? And you don't have to walk around to people and be like, we've set a boundary. You can just say, we're just going to say we're busy these nights. These are going to be our down nights. I think we skip the part where we make the plan and then we kind of go through life. And by we, I mean me going like, what? Yeah, I guess so. And then that's how your life is suddenly a mess.
We forget it gives other people permission to do the same.
Yes.
I have had so many people say to me when I'm like, you know what, we just really need some downtime this weekend. They're like, oh, that sounds like a really good idea. We actually do too.
Why don't we do that as well?
But no one wants to say it out loud. So be the first person to say it out loud.
Do everyone a favor and say no. Kelsey, Erica, tell our audience where they can listen to more of your brilliance, your boundary queenness.
More of Erica's wisdom. We have a really great episode, I think from 2 years ago, but it remains relevant, where we did an entire episode on what we are not doing this holiday season. It was a great episode all about boundaries, but everyone can find us, the Girl Next Door podcast, on any podcast platform. We are Hi Girls Next Door on Instagram, and our website is girlnextdoorpodcast.com.
We will link to that episode and to all of those places in the show notes. And Kelsey and Erica, thank you so much. This is a great conversation.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.